weeks ago, I preached a lesson and asked a question, what's wrong with our country? And we looked at the Ten Commandments in Exodus chapter 20. And, of course, the first 4 of the Ten Commandments speak of God and our relationship to God. And our lesson this morning will have be presented really kind of from that point. Because I'm going to ask another question. What is the greatest thing I can do to help my country in a difficult time that we have? You know, it's amazing to me how that so many times when we have anything that has a problem, whatever it is, that we tend to begin with the most complicated solution and then work our way back to the least complicated. When in fact, in most cases, really the problem is very simple. I remember many years ago, Brian bought a boat up in Smith County from an individual, cranked it in the yard, ran it, and then we brought it home and we decided on a Saturday we'd go over to Normandy and really try it out. And so we got over there and it wouldn't crank. Well, there happened to be an individual there who was a mercury mechanic, and so he began to basically disassemble the whole thing to see why it wouldn't crank. And it never would crank. And so finally, he put it all back together, and we gave up and we went home. And had the boat parked in the yard, and I looked over and I said, "What's that?" And he said, "That's the kill switch." And somebody had tripped the kill switch. And so we reached and flipped the toggle bolt, and the boat ran fine. Sometimes problems that look like really intricate, complicated problems are pretty simple. And they're pretty simple to solve. I didn't say easy. There is a difference between simple and easy. Being simple is not always easy. That's pretty easy to flip the switch, but it's not always that simple. But it's not always that easy, but it is that simple. You know, when you look at the Ten Commandments and you go through the first 4 and you get to the 5th, the 5th has to do with to honoring your father and mother. They have to do with good homes. I don't believe that's a coincidence. I don't believe it's a coincidence that God says that we are to first form a relationship with God, and the second thing that we need to be concerned about is our homes and what they're like, because that's going to have a tremendous impact. So if I were to ask what is the greatest thing, I would make this observation. Any person who doesn't realize that our country is in distress. Now, you know, I live in Cornersville, you live in Lewisburg, and we really don't have many of the problems that you see on the news in Portland, Oregon, Seattle, Washington, D.C., Detroit, Chicago. Obviously, they have tremendous problems that we really don't face. But we do have a lot of problems as a nation. And I hear the prayer mentioned here many times, praying for our country, and that our country's problems will be solved, and that it will become a better place as a result of that. So I believe it is something that Christians should be interested in. But the question is, what can I do? Well, when you go back to the Old Testament, we mentioned this in that lesson. We didn't really read it. But I've kind of learned over the years something in preaching. I've heard someone say one time that all you really had to do to be able to preach was just to own a good concordance. That you could just think up a topic, look it up in the concordance, and read the passages, and that's basically all you have to do. Well, that is what a lot of people do. But I think it sometimes gets us in trouble because we don't look at the context in which the statement is made. And sometimes the context tells us as much or more than the statement itself. God shows us the importance of Him being at the center of making a successful nation. If we're going to be the kind of nation we ought to be, then it's going to have to be like ours. It's founded upon the principle that all men are created equal. And that is, of course, saying that we are, as our Pledge of Allegiance says, one nation under God. Well, if that be true, then starting from that premise, let's read a passage in Proverbs 14. Usually all we read is verse 34. Verse 34 says, righteousness exalteth the nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. Well, let's go back up to verse 26. In the fear of the Lord is strong confidence, and his children shall have a place of refuge. The fear of the Lord is a fountain of life, to depart from the snares of death. Just think about it. If people had some respect for human life, we wouldn't have the murders that we have in the streets. And that's just a plain, simple truth. Would that make us a better country? Obviously so. In the multitude of people is the king's honor, but in the want of people is the destruction of the prince. He that is slow to wrath is of great understanding, but he that is hasty spirit exalts the folly. A sound heart is the life of the flesh, but envy, which is one of our biggest problems in today's world, is the rottenness of the bones. He that oppresseth the poor reproacheth his maker, but he that honoreth him hath mercy on the poor. The wicked is driven away in his wickedness, but the righteous hath hope in his death. Wisdom resteth in the heart of him that hath understanding, but that which is in the midst of fools is made known. Righteousness exalteth the nation, but sin is reproach to any people. The king's favor is toward a wise servant, but his wrath is against him that causeth shame. Now, we're going to talk about something this morning that's important. And that is, what can I do? Well, let's remember something. If we go back in history to the beginning of time, what is the first social unit ever formed? And you know what it was. God looked at man who had been created and said, it's not good for him to be alone. I'll make him and help meet for him. And then in verse 21, the Lord caused a deep sleep to fall. Everyone has read this many times. And the rib which the Lord had taken, he made a woman and said, this is now bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she shall take now of a man. Therefore shall a man leave his father and mother, shall cleave to his wife, and they shall be one flesh. Now you read that and you realize that is the first social unit. Let me ask you something. Think about it from your science class. As our technology has advanced, we have realized that there are smaller and smaller things that are used to produce the universe in which we live. You know, there was a time we used to think of molecules. That was it. You know, you had a molecule. Well, that we learned that wasn't true, and then went down to atoms. We learned that wasn't true. I don't know what the end will be, but at some point, we will get down to the smallest thing that's used to make up everything that exists on the face of the earth. But let me tell you something. There's absolutely no doubt and no question that if you're talking about this community, this county, this state, or this nation, that it is the sum total of the homes that make it up. Now, there's no doubt about it. It's dependent upon that. I mean, one of the things you read in Proverbs 31, if you don't have people, you don't have a nation. Well, you don't have homes, you don't have men and women in a relationship, then you're going to have a serious problem. You might have children, but without those homes, you may have some really serious problems. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But our nation is dependent upon our homes. And people don't seem to realize and understand that. I mean, we look at our nation, we say, oh, we got problems, we don't understand. We're going to try to do this and have this social program and that social program. We're going to spend so many billion, trillion dollars, whatever we're going to do. And then we get through with all that and we look and we say, nothing has improved. Well, why? Because at the core, the real problem exists not as a whole, but as the individual units that make it up. Well, what is it? It's the home. Now, you know, in sports, they always talk about a feeder system. In this area, for example, soccer is dominated basically by two counties, pretty much. It's Williamson and Rutherford, and they have very strong youth programs that they call feeder systems. So they feed the high schools. So the high schools get very good soccer players, so they're really good. You know the same thing would happen at our homes? Do you realize that? If our homes were what they ought to be, then who would be the citizens of the United States? You see, our nations, just like a sports team, are dependent on the feeder system. I mean, when you take folks out of a good youth program, they become a great athlete. That's no accident. If you take folks from a good home, you just think about it. You look at the people who succeed in life and look at what their background was in almost all cases. Some exceptions, but in almost all cases. Go to school and ask any school teacher where the problems come from in the school. And they'll tell you. It comes from the home. That's where the problem is. In many cases. Not always, but almost every case. So, when people ask the question, and we're talking to Christians, you need to try to build good homes, because our nation will be strong or weak depending on what that feeder system sends it. If our homes crumble, then our nation crumbles. That's a fact. And we need to understand it. Now, I realize that you say, well, we need to be interested in spiritual things. I understand that. But it is the spiritual things and being a faithful Christian that will make you the best possible citizen that you can be. So those two are pretty closely tied together. Now let's think about something else. You know, God gave us a plan for the home that will only fail when we fail in carrying it out. In the beginning, God intended the home to involve a relationship between one man and one woman. Now, if people go back to the Old Testament and say, well, God allowed polygamy. He did. You ever read about polygamy? You ever just go back and look? Just for a little information sometimes, go back and read probably the situations that are the most, where polygamy is talked about it more than anywhere else, is probably in the family of Jacob. Got to go back and read about it sometime, him and his 4 wives, and the problems that they faced because they ignored God's plan that a man ought to be married to a woman, and that's a home union. Just go back and read it. And answer me if you think that it was a great solution, that it was a great thing. Well, it was not. And under the New Testament, God didn't permit it. So when Jesus was asked a question about divorce, is it lawful to put away a man put away his wife for any cause? We talked about that a few weeks ago. When he answered it, he answered a lot more than that question. He didn't just answer the question about divorce, he answered a lot more than that. He defined marriage and called their attention to it. He said, have you not read that he which made them at the beginning made them male and female, and said, for this cause shall a man leave father and mother, shall cleave to his wife, and they twain shall be one flesh. Wherefore there are no more twain but one flesh. What therefore God hath joined together, let not man put asunder. Do you understand the significant difference that would take place if we just paid some attention to God's will? When we ignore God's will, we do so at our own peril. And it causes tremendous, tremendous problems. I've said in our nation today, some people misunderstand when I say it. I say that we really somebody says we don't practice polygamy today. Oh, yeah, we do. Yeah, we do. Not married to the same person at the same time, but we practice it in a way because we have so many people that. Brian was looking up somebody I said was married to so-and-so the other day. He said, well, she's married to him among other people. So sometimes you have children by all different parents, and you know and I know that it creates problems. What creates problems is ignoring God. And it doesn't matter if you're talking about an individual, whether you're talking about a home, or whether you're talking about a nation. But understand that everything that affects us individually and everything that affects us as a home affects our nation. And we can't separate it. We just can't do it. Now let's think about this. You know, God gave us an outline for the home. And this again is a situation where sometimes we don't read enough. I've kind of noticed over the last several years that even in my preaching, as I guess has been characteristic in most people's preaching, that we have a tendency to look up a passage that says what we want to emphasize and we read that. But the problem is, sometimes because we don't read the context, it doesn't really carry with it the impact that it should carry. Normally, when we talk about the home, we kind of go down to verse 22 of Ephesians 5, and we read through about verse 31. But let's go back up a little bit and see where he begins this discussion. See then that you walk circumspectly, not as fools, but as wise. Do you know what that means? When you go to a personal safety course, and a person's teaching a personal safety course, what's the first thing they tell you? First thing, in every personal safety course I've ever heard anyone talk about. First thing they say, be aware of your surroundings. When I took a driver training course at the post office, they said you should look into the rearview mirror every 2 seconds. Remember, you're going down the highway 70 miles an hour, and that's over a mile a minute. So you're crossing a lot of territory in a second. 2 seconds, you've gone a long way. Every 2 seconds. Why? Because you need to be aware of your circumstances. You're looking forward, so you're kind of aware of that, but you need to be aware of what's behind you. It's very important in driving. So when he's talking about walking circumspectly, not as fools, but as wise, he's saying you need to pay attention to everything around you. Redeeming the time. You know, you need to invest the time in the things that are useful because the days are evil. Wherefore, be ye not unwise, but understanding what the will of the Lord is. Be not drunk with wine, wherein is excess, be filled with the Spirit. And he starts talking about worshiping God. Speaking to yourselves in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making melody in your heart to the Lord, giving thanks always for all things unto God and the Father, in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, submitting yourselves one to another in the fear of God. Now you think about it. You say, this has nothing to do with the home. It has everything to do with the home. Everything. You know, if you stop and think, and you look at homes that are built upon faith in God's Word, and every member of that home, the husband and the wife and the children, when they reach the age of accountability, all of them are responsible to God and accept their responsibilities to God seriously. What does that do for a home? What if all of us decide we're going to do what we want to do and we don't care about anybody else's wishes, feelings, or benefit? Then what will that do to a home? Just stop and think about it. You know, it's interesting that we read verse 22 that says, wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands, and all people get up in arms about that. They don't realize that in verse 21 he had introduced that subject by saying, submitting yourselves one to another in the fear of God. You know, the fact of the matter is, we always get tore up because this says, wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands. Here are facts. If you're a student in school, who do you submit to? A teacher. If you go to work, who do you submit to? Your boss, your supervisor. If you're a citizen of this county, who do you submit to? The county executive. City of this state, who? The governor. You submit to a lot of people. I never have understood why we get all tore up because we're talking about have some order within the home. I don't really get that. I don't understand. I don't get that we don't get tore up because we have to submit to the president or the governor or the county executive. But if somebody says, oh, there's order in the home and the husband is to be the chief executive officer, I don't understand that. Why is that such a bad thing? Let me tell you something. The same God that tells you to submit, wives, submit yourself to your own husbands also said that you submit yourself to civil authorities. It's the same principle. There has to be order. Is there ever any order if there's nobody in control? Have you ever been in a situation where you say to everybody here, everybody do what pleases you, and it doesn't make any difference, and we don't care, and nobody's in control, and nobody's making the decisions? Is that possible? No. He goes on to say, husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church. So he says this is not a dictatorship. Therefore, as the church is subject to Christ, so let the wives be their own husbands. But the next verse says, husband, love your wives even as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for it, that he might sanctify and cleanse it for the washing of the water by the word, that he might present it to himself a glorious church, not having spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that it should be holy and without blemish. So he's obviously stating that this idea the Islamic community has, that your wife is a piece of property and only 3/5 of a human being, and you can treat her any way you please, including killing her if you want to, that's not what God had in mind. God had in mind an orderly situation. The husband's the head of the wife, but he has complete care for her, so obviously everything that she's interested in plays a part in any decision he ever makes. So they don't make decisions independently. They make decisions together. So ought men to love their wives as their own bodies. He that loveth his wife loveth himself. No man ever yet hateth his own flesh, but nourisheth and cherisheth it, even as the Lord the church. Almost every movie I've ever seen about wife abuse, when the police come to arrest the man, he said, "Oh, I love her." Well, okay, show it in a strange way. You beat her half to death. Just read that passage and think about it. We are members of the body, of his flesh, of his bones. For this cause shall a man leave his father and mother, shall be joined to his wife, and they two shall be one flesh. And he goes on to say, this is a great mystery, but I speak concerning Christ and the church. Nevertheless, that every one of you in particular so love his wife, even as himself, and his wife, and the wife that she reverence her husband. Now you think about all that. If we did that, if that was the norm in the United States of America, if almost everybody that you live next to was married to the same person all their life, so that their children were brought up in that family by their natural mother and their natural father, if that were done, and that were the norm and not the exception to the rule, answer me something, would we have a better country? Are you joking? Or are you kidding me? Let's think a little bit about what Peter had to say. Peter said something that's very important too in chapter 3 of the book of 1 Peter. He begins by saying, "Likewise, you wives be in subjection to your own husbands, that if any obey not the word, they also may without the word be won with the conversation of the wives. While they behold your chaste conversation coupled with fear. Whose adorning, let it not be that outward adorning, plaiting of the hair, wearing of gold, or putting on of apparel. Let it be the hidden man of the heart, in that which is not corruptible, even the ornament of meek and quiet spirit, which is the sight of God of great price. For after this manner in old time the holy women who also trusted in God adorned themselves, being in subjection to their own husbands, even as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, whose daughters ye are, as long as you do well and are not afraid with any amazement." I'll tell you something you ought to do sometime. You look at that, and it tells you that Sarah was subject to her husband. You got to go back and read something about their life sometime and see if it looks like a situation where he had a baseball bat and beat her over the head every time she said something that contradicted what he had stated. You don't see it. You see a very close relationship of two people who are interested in the same thing and striving to that end is what you see. And people pervert what God said. Because he also goes on in verse 7 say, "Likewise, ye husbands, dwell with them according to knowledge, giving honor to the wife as in the weaker vessel, as being heirs together to the grace of life, that your prayers be not hindered." Now, I've heard all kinds of arguments. I realize that in some ways a woman's body is much tougher than a man's, but I do realize this, that if you put them both in a combat situation, and I have people all the time that argue about this and say, "Oh, blah, blah, blah." Let me ask you a question. Simple question. The NFL is the highest level of football played really in the world. No question. I want to ask yourself a simple question. How many women have ever played in the NFL? Every time people keep arguing that men aren't stronger physically than women, just ask yourself the question. How many women ever played in the NFL? And the answer is none. Could a man physically beat a woman in submission if he wanted to? In most cases, yeah. He could do that. That's what this passage tells you can't do. That's what this passage tells you cannot be done. That this is a relationship built upon love and respect for one another. And if we just would pay some attention to that, not only will we be in right standing before God, but we would improve our nation. Without a question. But it's interesting, we usually stop there. But you notice something? He goes on in this passage and he says this, "As being heirs together of the grace of life, that your prayers be not hindered." I used to listen to Dr. Laura on the radio a lot. When I drove in the mail route, I just never really liked listening to music, so I listened to talk, any kind of talk. I didn't care what they was talking about. It made any difference to me. They was just talking. And Dr. Laura, I got to where I listened to a lot, had a lot of appreciation for a lot of things she said. She said that the number one thing that will make your marriage successful if you're on the same page when it comes to your faith. She's right. Because that's what God said. That's exactly what God said. Now you stop and you think about that. And you realize that if you try to build a home that's built upon the foundation of God's Word and both of you are committed to that practice, would that make this a better community? obviously. But I'll tell you something else that's interesting. He goes on in this passage and reading the next few verses to say, finally, be all of one mind, having compassion on one another. He kind of expands it beyond the home, but he also realized this. Whatever rules apply to your relationship with your neighbor in common fundamental principles of right and wrong apply to your marriage. There's no difference in them. Finally, be all of one mind, having compassion one of another, love as brethren, be pitiful, be courteous. Not rendering evil for evil or railing for railing, but contrariwise blessing, knowing that ye are thereunto called, that ye should inherit a blessing. For he that will love life and see good days, let him refrain his tongue from evil, and his lips from they that speak no guile. Let him eschew evil and do good, let him seek peace and ensue it. For the eyes of the Lord are over the righteous, and his ears are open to their prayers, but the face of the Lord is against them that do evil. The same responsibilities you have to your fellow man in general, you have in your family, to your wife, and to your husband, and to your children, and to your parents. Now, you just have more of them. People need to learn that. Would it make our country a better place? Obviously. You know, both in the Old Testament and the New Testament, parents are charged with making their children into productive people who will form new homes and make up society. Got kind of messed up there. I'm sorry. I had a little problem with that when I was putting it together, and I kept trying. I thought I had it all put back together correctly, but I messed up a little there. But that's the truth. If, you know, I watch a lot of the First 48. And sometimes they have the city of Miami on. I don't know anything about Miami. Never been there. So I don't really know anything about it much at all, except what I've seen there and other places. There's a place in Miami that's called Pork and Beans. That's the name of it. It's actually a housing project. Now, the people don't make any bones about it. Don't make any bones about it on the program. Almost probably 70 to 80% of the crime that's committed in Miami is there. You've got about a 6 or 7 block area, and that's where it is. If there's a murder, it's there. Do you know why? You have any idea why? They're all single parents. That doesn't mean there wasn't a father. There's one there somewhere. He may even live around there somewhere. He may even come in every now and then and kind of float through. But he's not a part of the home. So all these kids grow up, and people have completely ignored what God said, and we have a mess. What would happen if all those people had got married and had kids and taught their children to be productive citizens, pay your taxes, get a job? What would be the difference in the situation? Just think about it. Psalms 127 is such a tremendously important. I didn't put the verses because I was going to read it all. It's very short. Read it over and over and over and over again. You recognize it the minute I start reading it, but notice the first line. The first line. Except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it. Now, he's not talking about, he's using illustration here, and he's talking about a physical building, but he's actually talking about your home. Except the Lord keep the city, the watchman waketh but in vain. It is vain for you to rise up early, to sit up late, to eat the bread of sorrows, for so he giveth his beloved sleep. And then he said this. So if you don't know what he's talking about, you just read the next verse. Children are inheritance of the Lord, and the fruit of the womb is his reward. As arrows are in the hand of a mighty man, so are children of the youth. Happy is the man that hath his quiver full of them. They shall not be ashamed, but they shall speak with the enemies in the gate. Just think about what he's telling you. He's saying, if you want to live in a place that's good and decent, the most important thing you can do is build your home as it ought to be. And if everybody else would follow the same instruction, you'd live in a great place. In a great place. Sometimes I think about it. I grew up in Mount Pleasant. Graduated from high school in '65. Moved there, I believe, in the 6th grade, and I think that was the early part of '59, I believe. Lived on North Locust Street. Went to the movies almost every Saturday night as a 5th and 6th graders by myself. And not by myself, but myself and my friends. No parent. It was about, I don't know, about a mile walk, I guess, thereabout, to get downtown to the movies. Parents give you 50 cents or $1 or whatever it was, and that was enough to get you in the movie for 35 cents and buy some popcorn and a drink, and that cost you another 25. And so your dollar would take care of it. And all of us kids would get together, 3 or 4 of us, and walk all the way down there. Would you do it today? Would you tell your children you can walk a mile, even in a small town like Mount Pleasant, down to the movie theater and watch it and walk home at 11:30 at night when they're in the 5th or 6th grade? You know the reason why? The breakdown of the home. You say, oh, no, that's not true. It is true. It is true. You just think about it. What is the problem? How many times have I quoted? 92% of the prison population in the United States does not come from a home in which both the natural mother and the natural father were there. That's the truth. So what's the change? Primary change, our homes have been destroyed, and our nation's been destroyed because that's the unit of which our nation is built. Colossians 3, Paul talks about it extensively. And I picked Colossians 3 because of the clarity of it, beginning in verse 18. He said, for the same cause also do you joy and rejoice. Excuse me, I'm sorry, read Philippians. Colossians 3. Thought I turned to it, had not. Colossians 3, verse 18. Wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands. Read that before us. It is fit in the Lord. Husbands, love your wives. Be not bitter against them. Children, obey your parents in all things, for this is well-pleasing of the Lord. Fathers, provoke not your children into anger, lest they be discouraged. You read all those things, what do you see? You know what? We as parents, the number one thing that we accomplish with the home unit, I mean, why do you think that God put raising of children in a home setting with the father and the mother if it wasn't important? Why didn't he say raise them like cattle, throw them out in the field, prod them with a cattle prod every now and smack them with a whip, and they all live in a group, don't know who their mama is, don't know who their daddy is. Now, we've done that in our country, but unfortunately it hadn't worked out very well. Just understand, the most important thing that you can do for your country is to build a good home. You say, that's too simple. Yeah, it's simple, but it's the truth. You know, there's no saying that's still true. You know what it is? A chain is only as strong as its weakest link. And that's true. Are there some really great homes in our country and some people who still respect God's wishes for the home and try to live in accordance? Sure. But are there some that are not? Let me just tell you something for a moment and let you think a little about it. Our nation's like a chain. That's what it is. Oh, what are the links of our chain? You say individuals. That's really not true. Not 100%. Because our nation is a social institution. That's what it is. It breaks down from our nation to our state, to our county, to our city, and sometimes even to the neighborhood watch group. But anyway, it's a series going from the top down, and each one of them is a larger unit. But at the bottom of that, there is a unit. And that unit's a home. Now, when you look around you, all the people you know, and you look at their homes, how many of you consider to be strong links that are really contributing to society, and how many do you look at and say, I don't know about that? Now let's think a moment. Look at what we've done to our homes. Now, we discussed this a little in the other lesson, but I was going to be a little repetitive, and I'm sorry, but that's just the way it is. It's no wonder that our nation has problems. Let's look at this. How many divorces occur in the United States? Used to be the number was 1 in 3. And I kind of laugh because in my family there are 6 children who reached adulthood. There are 3 that have stayed married to the same person. There are 3 that have been married multiple times, some more than twice. And that's the way it is. That's kind of the way society is. Now, all of them had children. You ought to have a conversation with their children, ask how'd they like that divorce situation. What did that do to them? Did that make them feel real strong, real secure, and everything was great? Is that what they really believe? Did that really enhance the home and make it stronger? Or did that destabilize it? And then you have the live-in arrangements with no stability. If I'm guessing, I would say the number one reason that people live together and don't get married and live sometimes all their lives together and never get married is because they go back to the song that Glenn Campbell sang, that you throw your suitcase behind the couch, you don't sign anything on a line that makes you obligated. When you get ready to leave, you pick your suitcase up and go. Now that's the truth. So we have total instability. Total instability. What is a home for anyway? A home is to create social stability. That's what it's for. What does divorce do? It disrupts that. What does living together without being married do? It's the same exact thing. And then we do something else. We turn over raising of our children to others without questioning. I saw something last week that just amazed me. The school district said that parents were not permitted to look at any class. They couldn't walk in a room while their child was looking at a Zoom on television and see what the teacher said, and that they should not be shown by the students anything that was ever taught. I'm like, I wonder what we're teaching if we don't want anybody to see it. And there's a lady that raised a stink about that, and things changed. And they said, okay, we'll let you do it. But they said it was because of things. And I can understand that. You didn't want to be disruptive to the class. Parent don't need to come in and get on the Zoom and start telling the teacher something, obviously. But the real problem is that we just decide we're going to turn it all over. That we're going to hire babysitters, and we're going to hire daycare centers, and we're going to do nothing to raise a child, give them no instruction, and we just think, everything will be great. And there are a lot of other things. That's what we've done to our home. You know, if you think of something that's important, how do you treat it? The largest investment that most people make is their home, physical home, their house that they live in, their dwelling place. And so, if something starts happening to it and you decide you're not going to fix it, what's going to happen? It's not a very good place to live. So we generally fix them because it's important. Now, we may have something over there that's not important to us and it tears up, and we may say, we'll just give it to our neighbor, don't care. I'm not going to give your house to them. Your car is the second biggest investment. You usually fix it because it's important to you. What do you do with anything that's important to you? Pay some attention to it. You maintain it. What about our homes? Is there anything that's more important outside of our relationship with God than our relationship within the home? No. What can we do? Well, we can be strong in the Lord. That's what. It's kind of interesting to go back to the book of Proverbs, or the 3rd chapter. Read the first 10 verses. It's interesting to notice that he begins this thing by saying, my son. So he must be talking about someone very near and dear to him. For my son, forget not my law. Let thine heart keep my commandments. For length of days and long life and peace shall they add to you. Let not mercy and truth forsake thee. Bind them about thy neck. Write them upon the table of thine heart. So shalt thou find favor and good understanding in the sight of God and man. Trust in the Lord with all thine heart, and lean not unto thine own understanding. In all thy ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct thy paths. Be not wise in thine own eyes. Fear the Lord and depart from evil. It shall be health to thy navel, merit to thy bones. Honor the Lord with thy substance, and with the first fruits of thine increase. So shall thy barns be filled with plenty, and thy presses shall burst out with new wine. You know, it's kind of interesting to me that in that statement, what he's telling you is what's the most important thing in the world, your relationship with God. I preached a lesson several times in which I began with Genesis 1, the beginning God. And I preached the lesson about marriage. It said, in the beginning, God. If God's not in the beginning, then that home will never be what it needs to be, period. Now, you may do half of it if you're a believer in God and the other person's not. That'll help it. But if you're both believers in God and devoted to Him and to His ways, it will certainly be something that's beneficial. In my mind, and I don't believe there's even any debate, the most important thing that we can do to help our country is just improve our own. And I don't believe that there's really any way we get around that. Simple? Yeah, people don't like simple answers, but the truth. We're going to sing a song of encouragement. Now, we've not had a first principle lesson, understand that. But we have to impress this. Your relationship to God's the most important thing you have. Becoming a Christian and then marrying someone that's a Christian is extremely important because it will build a home that will help you, will help your children, and will help your nation. Think about it as together we stand as we sing.